We do a disservice to founders and entrepreneurs across Africa if the investors that we put them in front of don't actually know what they're doing. We train Africa-focused investors in all different types and shapes and forms to create more capital that's focused on African markets and then to make African investors more competitive in investing in Africa.
Mark, why do you do what you do?
Well, I think to understand why, it's important to understand what first. So to say what is, we train Africa-focused investors in all different types and shapes and forms to create more capital that's focused on African markets and then to make African investors more competitive in investing in Africa. Whether that means training individuals so that it's easier to hire local teams and have African-focused funds with actual African teams in Africa, which you'd imagine is a given, but it's actually not the case right now, or helping VCs raise more money to invest in Africa. Now, once you know the what, the why becomes more obvious. Most African VC at the moment is still predominantly foreign-led. Most African funds are predominantly dependent on international institutions, and most of them still lag behind their European, American, or East Asian peers when it comes to competitive or smart investment strategies. So there needs to be a lot of capacity building, but most capacity building is focused on entrepreneurs to date. And our belief is that we do a disservice to founders and entrepreneurs across Africa if the investors that we put them in front of don't actually know what they're doing or need a lot of help. So we're kind of plugging in the gap of investors to make sure that the investors that founders actually interact with are best placed to help them.
Before we actually get into Dream VC, if I had to ask you what contrarian truth do you believe about the world that not many people agree with you on, what would that be?
We can't address inequality. I don't think inequality is fully addressable. I don't think there is a utopian scenario where everybody will be equal and will have equal access to resources. I mean, that's technically communism, and I think most people in the room would agree that it's not the best idea of life. Naturally, a lot of things are unequal, but I think what I really admire in people is people who recognize that and still make them most of the limited resources that we all have to kind of get themselves as far as possible. And I think the VC space and startup space is a perfect example of that. You start your first business, you don't know anyone, you don't know anything, you're really hustling away and everyone's kind of on an equal playing field. But then by the time you're on your second business, your third business, you have some contacts from your first one, you have some experiences, you won't make the same mistakes, you have an unfair advantage, right? Well, that's great. Unfair advantages are why startups become successful. That's why, for example, as an investor, you love to see a business that's the second or third or fourth business that someone builds because they now have unfair advantages. So would you want to get rid of unfair advantages? Not necessarily. So my contrarian opinion is inequality in some cases can be good. And in some cases, it's obviously something we have to fight against as much as we can.
Do you feel like you're addressing equality right now with Dream VC?
Well, I think it's one of the core reasons why we started, just to make sure that access to VC is not as opaque or as ridiculously high stakes as it used to be. So you go back even 5-10 years, and most African funds, they're spending tens of thousands of dollars to bring in people from abroad. They're spending months to train them on the realities of business in Africa. It's very difficult to convince someone of an Africa strategy, and most of the teams are, well, frankly, white. So how do we address that? Well, we address that by having a predominantly African base. I think 90-95% of our students are Africans or Africans in the diaspora. And I think it's quite important that there is that empathy between founders on the ground and the actual investors that invest in them. So yeah, we're trying to make the space a bit more representative, which in itself, of course, stands for equality in access, equality in capital allocation, and a range of other things.
Okay, and speaking about Dream VC, how did you actually start it? Where did the idea come about? And could you walk me through that early journey to where it is right now?
Yeah. It's a valid question. I think for us, how we started is with a 5 a.m. conversation in March or April of 2021, technically, where my co-founder was sitting with me and we were discussing, and this was 5 a.m. after a long night, not 5 a.m. early
Waking
in the
up.
morning. This speaks to startup life. We were running an accelerator, which was relatively successful, that was working with young graduates and young professionals across Africa and placing them into working with various startups to support them at a very early stage. And the accelerator had been quite successful, and in the process of running that, one of our successes had been training our staff, mostly African staff across the continent, on thinking like VCs and acting like VCs and upskilling them essentially. And then in the process of doing that, we realized that almost nobody else was upskilling African professionals on VC, or actually making it more transparent, more accessible to get into VC. And both I and my co-founder had broken into VC since someone kind of took a dare, took a chance on us. I didn't have a finance background. My co-founder didn't have a finance background. We didn't have parents in family offices or with HNIs. So we kind of got into the space because someone said, okay, you guys have a lot of passion. You seem to really love what you're doing. I'm going to give you the opportunity. And because they did, 5, 6, 7 funds later in both of our cases, we've thrived in the industry. So someone let us in the door and then we made the most of that. So I felt, we should kind of give back and do the same for other people who don't have someone to let them in the door. And for me, the people who let us in were complete strangers. So why wouldn't we do the same for others all around?
And why specifically Africa?
Well, we were actually working in Africa at the time. So we were already quite passionate about African markets. My co-founder is Chinese American. She'd seen how the Chinese economy industrialized and then digitized over the course of just one generation. I'd seen something similar happen across Eastern Europe and some other markets where I'd worked in the past. We're both quite big advocates for the private sector and how important it is to have a sufficiently strong domestic private sector, which then allows for job creation and more advanced economies, which aren't just reliant on external help or support to get there. And I think when we were active in African markets, we realized that a lot of the people in Nigeria, Ghana, especially at the time, were super passionate about the same aims. So we figured if we have the potential resources or the networks that maybe some of them don't, to get them further along those lines, it'd be much better to be capacity builders rather than to just stay within our circle and remain investors in a pure sense.
And Dream VC essentially helps and educates, upskills individuals that work with investment firms or VCs themselves as organizations. What have you learned in terms of mistakes that they've been making?
I think the individuals have been sometimes a bit too hard on themselves. So there is nothing wrong with actually making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. I think what's really unfortunate is that often in many developing markets or emerging markets, we punish mistakes much more seriously than we reward success stories. A success story goes a certain way, but failure story, as like someone's mistake, is always blamed on them as a specific individual. You can't make any single mistake. It makes the news. Other VCs are talking about you. You made a mistake in due diligence. You made a mistake in valuations. Immediately, you're seen as a kind of scapegoat for everyone's mistakes. I think that's not a very healthy behavior on an individual level. I don't think people should be as kind of closed-minded to the fact that you can make mistakes and you learn from those mistakes. That's on the individual side. On the VC side, I think it's a bit of a zero-sum mentality. We are seeing this go away, but at least over the last 5-6 years, I've seen quite a large number of African funds kind of hoard information, thinking that, oh, well, if I know somebody, I definitely won't share that contact because what if they invest in someone else rather than me? This mentality that there's a limited amount of money, there's a limited amount of connections, there's a limited value to sharing information. I haven't seen as much cross-ecosystem, cross-border, or cross-fund collaboration as you see existing in most other markets. And I think that's natural because it's been an ecosystem that's so nascent and people are still kind of figuring things out and they're a bit worried about losing their kind of first market mover advantage. But what I like to see is that a lot of funds now, especially post-COVID, are kind of realizing that living in isolation is not actually very good for you. Sharing information with other funds, collaborating with other funds means that you can really strike harder and go further than you could in being a solo fund, whether that's sharing just deals, collaborating on LPs, whatever else it might be.
And these VCs and investment firms that you work with, what would you like to see more of them doing in Africa?
A selfish answer is upskilling, because then that means it creates more work for us, obviously, in helping them do that and upskill and become more professionalized. I guess beyond that, being a bit more open-minded to things like data-driven VC. So I think a lot of African venture capital is still quite manual, and the general consensus is, well, data is expensive and it's hard to digitize any part of VC, so let's just not do it. But the problem is that Africa's VC space is already 20, 30 years late to the game as compared to East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Eastern Europe. And if those ecosystems, other emerging markets ecosystems, are starting to embrace the use of digital technologies, we can't have African funds relying on Excel and Microsoft Word and Microsoft Access to do their day-to-day, right? So we want people to be a little bit more open-minded. But the flip side of that is that the typical African fund will have a much younger team than a lot of other international funds. It's just a testament to the youth of the continent at large. So if we can get more young people eventually into positions of authority, principals, decision makers, fund managers actually leading African funds, I think that will lead to the same leapfrogging that we referred to in the startup space. I can see African funds catching up quite quickly, and hopefully that will happen in the next few years.
Unrelated but related question: how do you get more risk capital into Africa?
Create the right incentives. So even pushing capital into Africa doesn't always mean pushing it from abroad. Sometimes it just means redirecting capital that's already within Africa towards the startup or investment space. So most capital or private money is not risk capital. The majority of it not. It's locked into secure, safe assets. So redirecting infrastructure funds, pension funds, governmental funds towards having at least a 1% or 2% allocation towards innovation funding could have a cataclysmic, enormous effect on the ecosystem. Could more than easily double, triple the amount of total VC funding going into Africa today in 1 year if you just created some government mandates to get African public institutions to invest in African fund managers. On a wider level, I think it's making the space a bit more accessible in terms of understanding to international investors. There's still this assumption that, sure, investing in an emerging market is risky, but investing in Africa is super risky, ultra risky. And investing in African venture capital startups is just so risky that fund managers laugh around the world, right? Well, that's not necessarily true. I think many people learn more by seeing things visibly. So actually bringing international fund managers, foundations, funds of funds, corporates to see Cape Town, to see Lagos, to see Nairobi, to see Kigali, Kampala, and Marrakesh, Tunis in person, understand that it's not quite the Africa that they've been taught to see, with a shack and some kid asking for funding. No, instead, it's a very well-developed ecosystem that has infrastructural issues, but that has a very large financial opportunity in building up and solving those infrastructural issues, and straight away moving towards technology adoption in a very young and very passionate population. So as long as we can address some of those misconceptions, it's really just a human barrier. It's not just governments or ease of funds. Those issues are already moving along. It's just addressing that sentiment. As soon as we can get that slowly and surely over the line, then I can see a substantial amount of funding flowing into risk capital in Africa.
Cool, Mark, thank you. Thank you for your time and all this valuable insight. I definitely learned a lot, so thank you. And
Fantastic.
enjoy the rest of your stay here in South Africa.